We interrupt this program to bring you a question. Do you know what a food bomb is? If you don't, here's one right now. There's more where that came from, regrettable edibles, prog rock, and more food bombs later in this interview. We now return to our regularly scheduled program.
Welcome back to another episode of the What's the Big Idea podcast, the podcast that interviews former associates of Big Idea Productions to talk about life before, during, and after VeggieTales. For today's episode, we'll be talking to Bryan Ballinger, a former 3D illustrator who created some amazing renders for Big Idea, alongside working at Microsoft and Nintendo Power. Find out more as we reminisce on the good old days with Bryan Ballinger. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today.
You bet.
Who are you?
I am Bryan Ballinger, and I am an artist of some sort. I do all sorts of different stuff, from illustrations to toy design to writing picture books to teaching, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. Murals. I do murals and sculptures.
What can you tell us about your early childhood?
My early childhood, I was born in New York City. Let's see, after we lived in New York for a while, then I moved to Vermont. I would say mostly I grew up in Vermont. I loved it in Vermont. I still love Vermont.
What were some of your favorite childhood activities to do on a nice, lazy Saturday afternoon?
I like to go stomping through the creeks around Vermont and go climbing up the different hills and the mountains. Like to hang out. I had a best friend, Heath, and I would do a lot of drawing and a lot of art, making lots of stuff and hanging out with our dogs and yeah, that kind of stuff.
What can you tell us about your family?
My dad was a pastor and a psychologist. My mom was a nurse. My sister is currently a librarian at Dartmouth University, Karen. And growing up, our main dog was Ernie.
What breed of dog was Ernie?
Ernie was half lab, half beagle. And he was not super bright. If he found a dead porcupine, he would roll on it. If he found a live skunk, he would bite it from behind and get a mouthful. And he was a bit of a pain in the butt, but he was a good dog.
When you were young, did you realize that you wanted to become an artist, or did that dawn on you much later?
Let's see. I would say probably fourth grade is when I knew that's what I wanted to do. A lot of that had to do with my friend Heath, because he was a much better artist than I was, but he really got me going on making art, and we used to make our own comic books and stuff. So yeah, right around fourth grade is probably when I knew that's what I wanted to do.
What was your school life like?
It was okay. Mostly just hung out with a couple of my friends. And once I got to high school, I pretty much hung out in the art room. I also took 6 years of Latin, so I hung out with the Latin class a lot. But yeah, it was okay. I was just awkward and I don't know, but still super into art.
What would you say is a favorite childhood memory that you like to bring out?
That's a tough one. Well, one of them is going up to Wisconsin where my grandparents lived, and I would spend the summers up there on my grandparents' farm, and that was pretty great up on Lake Superior. And so we get to go swimming and fishing in Lake Superior, so that would be a big one.
What did you do after high school?
After high school, I went to college. I went to the Columbus College of Art and Design, and I majored in illustration. So that was in Columbus, Ohio.
What were some of the skills that you learned, both for artistically and also just stuff in life?
One of the biggest things I learned in college was that particular college, at least at that time, really taught you how to work hard. I learned that if you're going to make it as an artist, you have to make art all the time, and you have to be really dedicated to it, and you have to meet deadlines, and you have to just keep getting better. So yeah, working really hard. Art isn't easy if that's what you want to do for a living. So that's one of the big things that I learned there.
Do you have any interesting moments, perhaps a teacher or maybe some funny shenanigans going on? Anything of that sort?
Shenanigans. Well, in our dorm room freshman year, we did not clean the sink for the entire year. So we went 1 year without cleaning the sink. We just kept basically it kept filling up, and then we kind of abandoned it and no one went near it. So after a year, stuff started to grow out of the sink and onto the countertops, and we would throw some bleach at it occasionally, but just kind of left it. And then at the end, when we had to clean it, it was alive. It would make sounds. You'd throw bleach on it, it would hiss at you. It took some actual chiseling to get all of the stuff off of it at the end of the year.
After you graduate college, what was the next move for you to do?
After college, I tried to get work in Vermont and I was unable to. Vermont is not very populated. So after doing that, I just decided, okay, this isn't working. So I got in my car and I drove out from Vermont to Seattle, drove out without having a job or a place to live. And I just went out there and it ended up working out. Ended up getting a job out there. I worked at Microsoft for several years. I was actually the first full-time illustrator to ever work at Microsoft. I worked on children's software there, designing and doing art and graphics for CD-ROM titles for kids, and that was the start of my career out there.
It said that you worked there for about 6 years working on the interactive titles like Encarta and Explorapedia. What can you tell some people who have probably never heard of such things since they were such a long time ago?
Yeah, this was before the internet was a thing. Encarta was a CD-ROM encyclopedia, so it was a digital encyclopedia that was accessed through a compact disc. And then Explorapedia was a children's version of that. So got to design a character that took you through the different parts of the encyclopedia. So yeah, it was, I mean, they're completely obsolete now with the internet and all of that. Good old CD-ROMs. You had to put it all on a CD, pop it into a computer, and go for it.
What would you say was your biggest accomplishment working at Microsoft and also your biggest challenge?
Biggest accomplishment was probably Explorapedia, getting to work on that. That and some of the friends and connections that I made there were awesome. I trained and taught myself Photoshop, the first version of it, before it was actually even meant to be used as an artistic tool, creating illustrations. So I would say one of my accomplishments was being one of the very first digital illustrators. Challenges working at Microsoft. Well, I am a bit of a nonconformist. I am also very much on the creative side, and that was an extremely corporate culture. So there was some challenges kind of fitting in there and working within, a large corporation like that. Yeah, that's what I would say. But overall, it was a great way to start my career.
Forgive me if I'm kind of jumping a little bit into the timeline, but one of the most interesting things that you were credited on was working for the famed Nintendo Power magazines.
Yeah.
What was the stuff that you did for those mags?
That was awesome. I really enjoyed working for them. So yeah, I did illustrations for the magazine for a bunch of different games and doing posters and stuff. That was probably, while Microsoft was maybe the start to my career, that would be another one, because that really got me started doing freelance illustration work. So again, and I was also one of the first people to be illustrating digitally. So it was a really good fit. I got to do lots of different illustrations for articles and advertisements for some of the games. Probably my favorite stuff I get to work on some Bomberman. If anybody even knows what that is anymore, that was a really fun game to do some graphics for and stuff. So yeah, Nintendo Power was great. It's so funny that I get emailed quite often asking if I have any of my artwork from when I was doing Nintendo Power stuff. I guess people really collect it now. The problem is that I was one of the first people doing the digital stuff, so there is no actual artwork that's collectible other than some old digital files. So
how long was your stint doing your freelance work at Nintendo Power?
I think I did work for them for maybe 2.5, 3 years, maybe something like that.
And do you remember what year specifically you were freelancing for them?
It would have been, let's see. So I moved out there in 91. So it would have been like late 91 to maybe 93, early 94.
I wanted to see if you possibly might have done something for, actually, no. You probably didn't, because that game was after you left Nintendo Power. I was referring to Earthbound / Mother 2, but
no.
Well, Bomberman is a instant gamers classic. So fortunately, they're making like newer Bomberman games on like modern consoles. So he's not super obscure, he's not super forgotten. So sure, the Bomberman fans listening to this pod appreciate all of the cool things you did at Nintendo Power. Yep. But from Microsoft to working at Big Idea, why did you decide to leave Microsoft?
So when I was at Microsoft, they ended up getting rid of their children's software division, and that's what I was most interested in working on. So I had the choice of, at the time, moving into more corporate, and I didn't really want to do that. And then at the same time, I had seen an episode of VeggieTales, so I just wrote them a letter and just mailed it to them and just said, "Hey, I'm a big fan. I'm a digital illustrator. I don't know if you guys would ever have a need for something like that, but yeah, just love what you guys are doing." And I got a call from them, and they said, "Hey, we need a 3D illustration person." And I had been learning and using a bunch of early 3D software, and so it just worked out. It worked out really well.
Now, I don't know if you said that you were a fan because you appreciated the actual series, or maybe you're just saying that just to get your way into the studio. But this question will most certainly reveal the answer to that. What would you say was your favorite episode from back then to what's your favorite episode
Oh,
now?
man. So I was a fan. I just loved what they were doing. I thought it was very different. Yeah, it was using the 3D computer graphics stuff, which I was also really interested in, but the writing was so strong and the sense of humor was just excellent. I love children's media, but one of my pet peeves is when children's media talks down to children or has a certain fakeness to it. And the VeggieTales stuff had none of that. It was funny, it was intelligent, it was well written. So yeah, I loved it. My favorite episode, my gosh, I don't know. I mean, I of course, because I like the sense of humor, I loved all the silly song stuff. I would say my favorite is probably both. Like when I started, we were working on Madame Blueberry, and I really loved that, and that is probably still my favorite.
That's actually a very popular episode with the fandom, especially. So,
Excellent.
I guess you have excellent
Yeah.
taste.
Yeah. That one just resonates.
Yeah, I find it interesting because that episode was basically released like during the commercial height of a big idea and stuff like that. You basically joined in right as things were starting to move along for the company.
Yeah, I started and then it just crazy. It got really big really fast. When I started, we were still downtown, on a floor in a building right downtown Chicago, and it was not that big. And then we soon after moved out to Lombard and to the larger studio. So, yep.
What was your first day at Big Idea like?
It was great because I'd come from Microsoft where we were in all these large corporate buildings, all sectioned off into different offices, and it was very, very corporate. And then starting at Big Idea, we were on this one floor in this building, and stuff was stacked all over the place, and everybody was really creative. People had funky stuff hanging up all over the place. I just felt a lot more comfortable there. And then the design team that I was part of, everybody in it was great. I've remained friends with everybody that was on that team. It was cool too because I could interact with Phil and Mike were just there walking around, and I could interact with them all the way up to that level. So yeah, great vibe, great people, all really creative and all kind of really into it and excited to be there. So yeah, it was really really great place to work.
Now, you being a 3D design illustrator, what exactly does that mean for people who do not know that?
Basically, I did illustration work using 3D computer graphics. So I was using the same software that the shows were made with, but then if we needed, I would illustrate children's books, do posters, and do the covers to all the DVDs, basically using the software and building new models and using the assets from the shows. That's what I would do. And then I would help out sometimes doing some of the modeling on the shows too.
What would you say were some of your favorite projects while employed at Big Idea? Like, was there like maybe a particular illustration that you did, particular cover that you did, poster or something like that?
Yeah, the picture books, God Made You Special and God Loves You Very Much. I illustrated both of those. Those were two of my favorite projects. They really let me kind of just take the text and do the illustrations that I wanted. And those things sold tons and tons of copies. So that was really fun. I would say my favorite project might have been I did a calendar where they said, we just need a calendar. And they just let me go on it. And so I ended up doing a calendar where each month was a different place from around the world that the characters were visiting. And I got to work in all sorts of puns and illustrating them, next to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And then I had a Leaning Tower of Peas there, and then a Leaning Tower of Pizza. Particular illustration was really fun too, because I had to make a 3D model of a statue made out of pizza. And so we were at Lombard at the time. The studio was actually in a mall. And so I went out and bought some pizza. And then I went over to one of the scanners and I took the pizza apart and I scanned in the pepperoni, the cheese, the sauce, and the crust all separately, and then used those as texture maps and built the pizza in 3D each layer, and then textured it with real scanned in pizza textures. And then I got in trouble because I think it was the marketing department went to use the scanner and they got grease all over their charts and stuff. So I had to go and clean all that up. But anyway, that was super fun.
Yeah, I remember when I believe it was rediscovered on Twitter probably a couple of years ago, and all I could think of was like these renders are really, really cool. It sort of seemed like last hurrah because, as you probably were aware, Big Idea switched their old software, Softimage, to Maya, and that was released like I think 99 or 2000. So it was like one of the last times I guess that those older character models were used up before they switched them out for the new ones. I'll ask you a little bit more specifically on that in a bit. Those books that you mentioned, I actually interviewed the author of that, Cindy Kenny,
yeah.
who was a fantastic guest.
Got to work with Cindy on those.
What was working with her like?
She was great. She was really nice. I liked working with the whole publishing department. Yeah, that whole crew was really fun to work with. And yeah, those books. So I still get notices from the publisher every time they sell another couple 100,000 or whatever it is. So yeah, those books did really well.
One of the interesting things that I brought up to Cindy was that in some of her books, the artist kind of had free reign to add in a bunch of characters that weren't seen before, or at least seen in a while. And in those books particular, I remember the Great Family from God Wants Me to Forgive Them. So I'm assuming that you were just kind of given that creative freedom to choose whatever characters you wanted to use.
Yeah, it was fun too, because one of them, I had all the characters doing different types of art projects, and I got to come up with what all of those were. They were like gluing macaroni and painting it and stuff. And so yeah, that was fun. And then pairing a different art project with each of the characters was great too.
Getting back to sort of the earlier days of working at Big Idea, you brought up the episode Madame Blueberry. Did you do any work on that episode, or was that episode kind of already mostly done?
That episode was just finishing up right when I started. So I didn't get to do work on the show, but I got to do a bunch of illustration work for, the cover for the DVDs and the VHSs and doing posters and stuff for it.
And that episode is also significant because the older VeggieTales covers actually looked very different. So was it like sort of a mandate to keep it in this certain new style or new look, or to avoid the old one, or what was kind of your instruction of when it came to designing those materials?
Well, I worked with other designers there. So I think at the time, it's probably Ron Eddy. Paul Conrad was another designer that started shortly after, but Ron was like the main guy when I started. He was the main guy who designed the overall look of it. And then he would then work with me to do the illustration part of it. Yeah, they had a very talented design department. Those folks in there were just great, and they've all gone on to do a lot of other stuff. Two of them, John Troush and Paul Conrad, are working at Pixar now. So they would do the kind of the overall look and the design of it with the patterns and everything and the color palettes, and then they would work with me on doing the 3D illustration part of it.
Now, my next question was that the episode after it was End of Silliness, and considering that was also released the same year, was that a project that you were more involved in from the get-go?
Trying to remember. I don't think I did, because when I would help out actually on the shows, I was only doing little bits and little, modeling, discrete modeling parts of it, just to help out, just to keep up with their scheduling and stuff.
Maybe if I give you some descriptors, mainly for the cover, because it has like Larry kind of looking crazy.
Yeah, that had the big it had like the swirly the swirly cover. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So yeah, I did that. Yep, I did that cover. I feel like I did some other stuff actually in it too. I can't remember anymore, but yeah, I do remember doing that cover. It was green and orange spiral on it, if I remember.
Yeah, that's what it was. It's a very iconic cover, and also one that's very unique because you see Larry very distressed in that cover. He's going mad.
Yeah, he's super worried. Is that Yeah, if I'm remembering that correctly. He's like kind of peeking in and he's like, ah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you said, the design team, it wasn't just you working on all the design stuff, but I also really dig the color contrast with the greens and the oranges. And then on the back of the tape is when it's all like purple and stuff like that. So I just really, again, I don't know if that's you specifically, but just in general, I just really like how the overall design for that episode came out in the end.
Yeah. I can't remember who the designer was that I worked with on that. It would have either been probably Ron Eddy or could have been Todd Mock as well. I'm not remembering, but yeah, both of those guys are great pattern, color, and overall design and composition guys.
Yeah, and also since you mentioned poster, and since you said that you worked on that episode, I would imagine that you also designed the poster for it as well. And I remember seeing it in the studio tour for 2002, where Mike Naraki had a poster like that in his office.
I remember now too that poster that was rendered with Softimage. I remember that was like the biggest and highest 3D resolution thing we had ever rendered. It was really maxing out the computers, and I remember recreating the textures so that they could be rendered that large. And it took a long time, and I think I had to render it in parts and then put it back together again in Photoshop because it was it was really pushing it at that time to make something that large. Now I remember because and then I had to like remodel Larry to make him smooth so we wouldn't see the polygons and stuff when we rendered him out. Now it's like any old laptop or iPad could render that out. But yep.
Now, the year 98 is also pretty significant because I remember Phil Vischer said, I believe in like behind the scenes, that was the year that a bunch of people at Big Idea were kind of splitting off to try to figure out what was the next software to use to try to enhance the show. So eventually, because the animation studio went on to Maya, obviously that meant that everybody in the design department also had to get familiar with Maya. So how smooth or how rough was that transition?
That transition it wasn't easy for me. I remember I enjoyed learning Maya. It was a little rough at first. Like at that time, we had also started hiring other 3D illustrators, and so we had to kind of split it up because we had all the old assets, and we were still rendering stuff out using stuff from older shows. So we had to kind of split our team up, and some of us learned Maya and were using Maya, and then other ones had to stay on Softimage for a while. We actually had to keep it around for a long time just because if we needed to use one of the old shows and any of their assets. So yeah, it was a little tricky. I still use Maya. I was a big fan of Softimage when it was the thing.
Now, again, because you mentioned poster work, one of my absolute favorite posters was this teaser image of Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed that was very dark, and it had Larry Boy in the shadows, and then underneath was the Larry Mobile. And it was a poster, I think, saying July 2002. Same thing with End of Silliness. Does it sound like you worked on it? What was that like doing such an incredibly badass poster?
Yeah, that poster was so fun. Again, that thing was so big, really pushing things again. But yeah, that poster was another one of my favorite things to work on. Like the lighting and the colors and the design of it was a good one. Again, back then to render out stuff that large, we had to break it up into small pieces and then composite it together again. Does that one have the Larry Mobile in it?
Yeah, it has the Larry Mobile underneath Larry Boy, and then on the sides are like some buildings.
Yeah. I remember I had to like rebuild some of the Larry Mobile to make it so that it would look right that big, and yeah, that was a fun project.
The main reason why I remember that poster beside it, again, looking absolutely amazing, was because Kurt Heineke actually has it hung up at his home studio.
Uh-huh.
So then we come from another really iconic episode to King George and the Ducky, the first one having Maya. And for me, what really stuck out was that the characters on the cover actually look slightly different from the characters in the show. Was that sort of intentional, or was it something that just kind of happened on its own? Just for further clarification, in King George, the pupils on the characters are more circular than they are ovals. And that was the typical VeggieTales art style. And in the cover, they have the ovals instead of the circles in the actual show. Was that, again, something intentional, or was that something, I don't know, kind of accidental?
That's a good question. I don't remember why that was. I remember doing that cover. It may have been that at the time when we were making all the marketing materials and stuff, that they had not finished all of the new character versions. I'm guessing that's what it was. So we were probably using older characters for some of it because we had to make a lot of the stuff before the shows were finished. I also have a vague memory of having remade the ducky in that for that cover too, so that may have looked a little bit different. I don't remember.
One of the most memorable parts about the whole King George design aspect of it was, of course, the usage of bubbles, something that in 3D is
Yeah.
very easy to screw up. What was it like?
Oh man, you're doing a deep dive now. I remember doing the bubbles for a bunch of King George stuff. Yeah, I made different bubbles than they had in the show. I remember I was making those and Phil stopped by and he was like, "Man, those are hyper real bubbles." I spent a lot of time trying to get really nice bubble renders, which is way easier now. But back then, the rendering and the calculations and stuff was you really had to fudge and work around things to get the bubbles to look right. I don't know if that was on the. I think there's a King George poster that I did that had. Are you familiar with a poster from that? Because I did one that was just like totally filled with all these bubbles that took me forever to get them to look right.
Unfortunately, I'm only familiar with two, though it seems like we might have some VeggieTales lost media on our hands. The one being like a bigger version of the cover, I believe. And then there was one for the premiere of King George and the Ducky that was just the ducky and had some water underneath it, and it was completely all white. And I think
Yeah.
it said, yeah, so something to the effect of a king and a ducky. I don't remember.
Yep.
Those are the only two. But like I said, it sounds like some possible lost media on our hands.
Yeah, man, I need to go through all my old files and stuff and look because yeah, I have like zip drives and SideQuest cartridges and stuff that you can't even. There's nothing to even read them anymore with a bunch of my old files.
The episode after that was Esther, the girl who became queen. And to me personally, I don't like it, doesn't really stick out too much besides it just being a nice cover and all. Maybe I might have some cool little tidbits doing some stuff for Esther.
Yeah, Esther. Most of what I remember from Esther was that character was a little bit hard to pose. And I can't remember if it was because of the hair or what, but she was a little bit hard to finagle to get her to do what I wanted to her to do to pose her for the stuff. I think she also had a more seems like she had a more complex costume or one of her outfits was more complicated too. That was kind of a jump up in some complexity and some animation for the VeggieTales stuff, which was just made things a little more complicated.
As soon as you brought up hair, I was going to say it probably was like that because a lot of the animators recollected about how troublesome the shadows would be on her face to the point that they decided that Esther no longer can be used because of that gosh darn hair that kept flying in the front of her face.
I had the same thing when I would go to light her. There was always that shadow from that strand of hair that would go right across her face. Yep. That's funny. I hadn't thought about that in a long time.
And also getting a little bit more technical here, when I think of King George and Esther, I think of two words: anti-aliasing. What can you tell us about anti-aliasing?
Oh man, it's a technical term that smooths out edges on jagged pixels where there's a lot of contrast between pixel values, and anti-alias basically go through and add in pixels along the edges to make it look smooth. And back then it was even more important because of how low resolution everything was. If you didn't do that, you would see jagged edges all over the place wherever there was contrast going on. So, and I remember sometimes having to, I mean, this is really technical and geeky, but I remember going in by hand with the pencil tool in Photoshop sometimes when we'd get a render that we'd have edges that were real jaggy and having to go in and add in pixel by pixel, add in some smooth edges onto things. What made you think of that?
I remember watching the commentaries to King George and Esther, and the reason why I bring those episodes up is because in those commentaries, Bill Vischer and Mike Naraki talk about how in some of the stuff in the distance, for example, in King George, they bring up some of the buzzing carpets, and also I believe in the part where Junior's singing "I Love My Duck," it does a camera swirl. When it's an overhead shot, you see a lot of buzzing against Junior's bathtub and also his house that he was in. And in Esther, in the final shot where they're doing that nice big camera sweep, zoom out sort of thing. The bushes and a lot of the palace detail gets very fuzzy, which is why I brought up anti-aliasing.
Yeah, certain patterns and things would give you that kind of buzzing and weird visual effect that you typically don't want. But yep.
Also, kind of jumping back a little bit, back in 1998, what I remember seeing was a couple of years ago, this one Twitter account actually showed off several never before seen prototype cover images of the older VeggieTales episodes when they were being re-released to general market. If you remember anything, can you tell us about some of those interesting alternate cover designs that were never used?
If you only knew how many designs and alternate versions of things that never got used, there were tons. Because a lot of times we'd put together, pitches for what a cover would look like. So you might do 10 different versions or more, and then show them, and then they'd get approved, and then all the other ones just went away. So yeah, if I had access to all my SideQuest cartridges, I could show you a bazillion variations on all sorts of stuff.
Now, typically around this time is where I kind of separate big idea eras because you came in from 98, the peak, and as you said, it was a very small company. And then as the years went on, big idea started rapidly expanding.
Yeah.
From about 2000 to, let's say, about 2002, what would you say the atmosphere around big idea was?
I mean, it was exciting because there were all these opportunities, but it was definitely changing. When I started, I knew everybody. And then, by 2002, I kept seeing new people that I never knew, I had never met, had no idea what they did. So it became a little less personal just because of how fast it was growing, and the vibe changed some just because of the size and how fast things were going. It was still pretty I mean, I still enjoyed it. The team that I was on, I knew everybody on there, and I would say the design team was a little more insulated from maybe some of the speed of the change and stuff, just because we were a smaller department, although we were adding on too. It was less scrappy feeling. It was becoming a little more, I don't want to say corporate, because compared to Microsoft, it was definitely not corporate, but it was just getting bigger and feeling less personal, I would say.
Now, as I asked Keith Lango, I have to ask you because I believe you're the creator of this one amazing place that unfortunately does not exist, though maybe does in your home office. Thailand. What can you tell people about Thailand?
Okay, Thailand was basically the 3D design department, and I had and still have a massive collection of ugly ties as I could find. And so I had a massive collection. So then we just decided to string up a bunch of clothesline. We put them all up, and it surrounded our whole department. So it was sort of our walls, and it was just ugly tie after ugly tie, just kind of going all the way around us. It was pretty spectacular and caused a little bit of vertigo just because of all those different clashing giant ugly ties. Yeah, it became pretty popular for when they were giving tours and stuff. They'd bring folks by, and yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
One of the more fascinating things that Keith Lango told me about Thailand was Thailand's ties to progressive rock. What kind of music were the people of Thailand consuming?
Yes, prog rock was probably the dominant musical genre that we would listen to. So that goes anywhere from, the classic stuff like Yes and Rush and King Crimson, listening to a lot of that, to, at the time, some of the newer prog bands like Porcupine Tree was a big favorite. Yeah, we would crank that up, and complicated music, but yeah, prog rock and Thailand were definitely linked together.
And another thing that is very much linked to you is, of course, regrettable edibles. What can you tell the people about regrettable edibles?
So I collected ugly ties, and then I also collected absurd non-perishable food items. So it had to be food that could sit on a shelf and not deteriorate, but that was strange and unusual. So you had things like, Vienna sausages would be a more pedestrian, but definitely an option for what would be on there. But then we also had, pickled pig snouts, and oh my gosh, the bloater was probably my favorite food item that we had there. Bloater is what was so great about it, not only because the name is so wonderful, but the main ingredient was other fish. So that was a good thing.
Now, I have two questions in conjunction with regrettable edibles. Do you still own a collection of regrettable edibles? And then the follow-up would be, would you consider weed to be a regrettable edible?
So the answer is most of that is gone now for several reasons. One is I had a can of pork brains in milk gravy that I had in my closet here in our house, and it one day it had exploded, and it was probably 15 years past its expiration date. So when that happened, my wife was not happy about having that stuff in the house anymore. So I moved the entire collection to the university where I taught, and it stayed there for a while, but then over the summer we had a problem we had like an infestation of flying squirrels, believe it or not, and they got into a lot of the regrettable edibles and spread them all around one of the computer labs. So that was kind of the death knell for regrettable edibles. I would consider weed probably not strange enough to go into that collection. And even though it doesn't smell the greatest, it smells way better than a lot better than an exploding can of pork brains and milk gravy.
And speaking of exploding cans, Keith Lango told me the story about trying to mix a bunch of chocolate. I don't remember all the specific details because it was just so crazy. I believe that you'll probably remember it better than I did. But it was like stuffing chocolate,
yeah,
the giant food volcanic explosions. Tell people your perspective on that.
Okay, so Keith and I were working together, and they had free beverages at Big Idea, which was great. And one of the things that they had was Yoo-hoo, which is a very odd and kind of a strange beverage, but it's a chocolate-based beverage. We had an open thing of Yoo-hoo that had got left out, and I don't remember for how long, but it was way past when you would want to drink it. And so we decided that the best thing to do with it was to shove a chocolate donut into the bottle as well. Then we capped it, and then we thought, well, what are we going to do with this? So we put it inside a paint can, and then we sealed the paint can, and then we thought, well, what are we going to do with that? We set it next to the accounting department, but then there was a bunch of really thick old computer manuals, so we thought we'd better stack those on top of the can. So we put those on top pretty high just to make sure, nothing bad would happen. One morning we both got in early, and we were sitting there working, and this was before there was much of anybody else in the studio, and we heard a really loud explosion, and we heard this bam, and then we both looked up, and we saw a geyser of Yoo-hoo shooting straight up, and it hit the ceiling, and it hit the ceiling, and it went all over the place. Well, all over the accounting department. It actually shoved all of those manuals off, blew the top off the paint can, and then we basically took us a half hour and an hour to clean up the accounting department before they all got in there. My guess is there is still a brown stain on the ceiling in that mall.
What other crazy stories, science experiments gone wrong can you tell us that happened at Big Idea?
That was actually the beginning of making food bombs, believe it or not. So I carried that tradition on with me to when I started teaching college and actually started working it into some of my assignments. If you ever want to watch a really great video, go on Vimeo and look up Smorgasbomb. It's a great video showing a bunch of different food bombs that we made. So we made another one with circus peanuts that worked out pretty well. In fact, I remember when we exploded that one, we exploded it in a parking lot, and the circus peanut actually blew through the cap of the bottle that it was in and wedged halfway between the bottle and outside the bottle. Just like somehow, a circus peanut is like foam, right? It defies explanation how it could burst its way through a plastic cap on a bottle, but it did. So that was a good memory. I also just remember the studio at the time. We were in the mall in Lombard, Illinois. There was this nondescript sort of hidden little door that you would just open, and all of a sudden you were stepping between the animation studio and you were right in the middle of a mall. It was really surreal. Remember that was kind of fun.
And I've heard this, so you could confirm or deny this.
Okay.
But I heard another funny incident that you pulled was that while you were working at Big Idea, you would play the electronic album Soothing Sounds for Baby by Raymond Scott, and you'd play it much to the dismay of the accounting department, so much that they gathered around your work desk and told you to shut it off. Is this true or not?
Here's the thing is, I mean, an album called Soothing Sounds for Baby, you would figure would be soothing. If you haven't heard that album, you really need to go listen to it. The cover has a baby, and then it's got like a waveform that's going right through its ear and coming out the other ear. And it's pretty accurate in how it sounds. It's sort of soothing, and then it has these really sort of high pitched tones that just kind of right through the middle of the music. So yeah, kind of a toss up between that one and then I have another album. It was kind of like science. So I would play stuff and then I would try and see, how much people could take. The other album that came close to Soothing Sounds for Baby was It's Music Played by Elephants. That stuff is rough because you'll be listening to it and the elephants are playing and your mind wants to sort of latch onto a consistent beat, like a human meter and a human beat, and the elephants don't do that. So after a while it does things to your psyche. But yeah, the Soothing Sounds for Baby, yes, there was a revolt.
I want to switch focus a little bit to talk about some of the people that you remember most about Big Idea. But I don't think you remember anyone as much as you do your lifelong buddy, Keith Lange. What can you tell us about Keith Lange?
Keith and I were, I would say, very much kindred spirits, kind of nonconformist, but also very creative. Keith is also super smart, but also very artistic and very creative at the same time, and also very mischievous. So we got along great. He's one of the only people that I've ever worked with where consistently, when we would put things back and forth when we were working on projects together, it always comes back better after you give it to Keith and then you get it back again. But yeah, super creative, super funny, up for anything. He was great. Loved working with him.
I wish I could remember the exact words he used to describe you, but from what I remember, he said that you are a pretty silent guy with a very hidden sense of humor and comedy. Would you say that that is a correct assessment of your character?
Probably not overly emotive or out in front, alpha, any of that. But inside, yeah, I like to laugh at a lot of things and I like to push buttons for comedic effect, I guess. But behind the scenes.
And of course, you two being such an iconic pair, it only makes sense that you guys would collaborate on a children's book known as The Great Cheese Squeeze. What can you tell us about The Great Cheese Squeeze?
That's a book that we did together. And actually, the two characters in the book are kind of versions of us. But yeah, that was so fun to work on with him. That is probably the most collaborative thing I've ever worked on with somebody. We wrote the story back and forth together. I'd write some of it, send it to him. He'd write some back. We'd send it back and forth and back and forth. Same with the illustrations and the characters in it. It's got our sense of humor in it. It's got a mouse character who's an inventor and who also carves toes out of cheese. And then you've got the frog character who has a real foot odor problem and they live in a lighthouse on the prairie, of course. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. We have some ideas for some other ones too that I would love it if at some point we could work on those together again. But yeah, that was great.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because why hasn't there been a Great Cheese Squeeze 2? Because if I remember correctly, it was supposed to be a series of books.
Yes.
So there was supposed to be more than just the one. Why hasn't there been another Great Cheese Squeeze?
I would say, well, for one thing, Big Idea went through some massive changes. And so when the studio kind of imploded, that put the kibosh on that. And then I did manage to get eventually, and it took a long time, I managed to get the rights back to it. So I'm hoping that at some point we will get to do some more together. But yeah, since we both went different places, it's been hard. He's super busy all the time, and I'm generally fairly busy too. But yeah, I'm hoping that we do get to continue that now that I have the rights back to the intellectual property for it.
That is also the same thing that he told me, that since he's obviously still in the animation industry, a lot less free time to do fun stuff like that, but who knows? And if it ever does come back, I don't know, try to do like a GoFundMe campaign or something like that. Just so that seems to be the cool, trendy, hip thing nowadays.
Yeah.
That'd be a cool way to reintroduce it.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll get to do that.
And I'm hoping that you can also give some equally high praise to some other employees that you worked with at Big Idea. Besides Keith Lange, what were some other people that you have nothing but good things to say about.
That's going to be a long list. Everybody in the design department, I had a blast working with. Let's see, just within the 3D design department, there was Mike Sanderson, who I'm still very good friends with, and we still talk a lot. He was a 3D illustrator, really great guy. Brian Roberts, who's moved on to doing a lot of great stuff. James Breckenridge, and then Keith too. And then still really good friends with Paul Conrad, who is the head of the design department. Super talented. One of the most talented people I've ever known. Also great sense of humor. He's a designer and illustrator and concept artist at Pixar now. John Troush, another great designer, really fun guy. He's actually working at Pixar now too. Let's see. Jody Nilsson was one of my favorite people there. She was an illustrator, 2D illustrator there. Super funny lady and one of the most talented artists I've ever known. Todd Mock was another great designer that I got to work with there. Let's see, Steve Leeper, another lifelong friend. He was head of the layout department. He's also a very good stop motion animator. And he and I started the animation program at Huntington University after we left Big Idea. Yeah, he's another good friend from there. Tom Owens. He was a storyboard artist there, since worked at DreamWorks and worked at a bunch of other places, but he's another prog rock fan, so we talked a lot about music. Chris Meidel was another good friend from there. I still keep in touch some with Phil. It was great getting to know Phil there, and Mike Naraki is about the funniest person you could ever meet and really great guy. Bill Haljan. Oh man, I could just go on and on. That place attracted so many awesome people. It's kind of mind-blowing. But yeah, I don't know. I could go on and on and on.
If you thought that was all of the secrets, then you're dead wrong, pal. Join us next week as Bryan details more of his amazing Big Idea career. I'd like to thank Bryan for his time and for sharing all of the amazing secrets as well. You can find Bryan on Facebook, X, and his website. Links all in the description. I'd also like to thank MrLunch for all of the additional research as well. And until next time, we'll see you guys on the next What's the Big Idea podcast.